We have a very large group here, and of course we can't do personal introductions, so I'd just like to acknowledge the groups that are present here with us today. We have representatives from government, both central, provincial, and local. We have representatives from water and sanitation utilities, academia, international development organizations, and financial institutions, along with NGOs, CSOs, and philanthropic organizations. The private sector is also represented, representing product services and consultancies, and we also welcome members of the media. To all of you, a hearty welcome. With our introductory information behind us, I'd like to introduce you to Neeta Pokhrel, Chief Water Sector Group of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank. Neeta, you have the floor next to share with us some opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you are. I'm delighted to welcome you to the ADB Sanitation Dialogue 2021. This virtual gathering, starting today and ending on April 22nd, is bringing together a record number of participants. Over 800 registered from 71 countries. And as you know, we also get many unregistered participants who will join in at the dialogue. I especially would like to welcome our government partners from our developing member countries. Of course, Andrea has already listed the other partners, development members, civil society, NGOs, academia, private sector, utilities. Sanitation is indeed everyone's business. Now, we are glad that you're here with us to dialogue on issues, challenges, and practical solutions and how we can collectively increase access to sanitation services, which are safe, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive. Now, we held our first sanitation dialogue in ADB in 2009. I attended it. And I remember that participants at that first dialogue emphasized how lack of sanitation is an assault on human dignity, and that the governments must prioritize and include this as a priority in all the local and national investment plan. Here we are 12 years later at our sanitation dialogue again, and about 1.2 billion people still have no access to basic sanitation services in our region, in Asia and the Pacific alone. And over 450 million people still defecate in the open. It is estimated that our region requires $53 billion annually on an average up to 2030 to finance this water and sanitation gap and meet our SDG goals. Now, it's not that we have not made progress, we have, but much, much more is needed. And more importantly, we must radically rethink our approach. Business as usual is really not going to get us there. So the challenge for now, all of us collectively, is to flush away business as usual mentality. We need a different way of doing things so that everyone can have access to sanitation services and benefit from this. So at our ADB Sanitation Dialogue, starting today and ending on 22nd April, we plan to facilitate precisely this, dialoguing on business unusual. Over the next 2 weeks, we will all hear many distinguished speakers and experts, and who will share their knowledge and lessons learned on how to increase access to sanitation. And it has to be inclusive sanitation services. And we will do that through 6 webinars and 6 workshops. I hope you can join all of them. Our experts, dignitaries, participants will share their practical examples and case studies to show possible solutions on how to overcome sanitation challenges, including citywide inclusive sanitation approach. All the webinars and workshops we have tried to design to meet the needs of our partners, especially our developing member country partners. And we also, during these 2 weeks, intend to showcase our ADB, how ADB partners can help all stakeholders in achieving our sanitation security targets. And we trust that all of you will leave this event with a vision, specific action points, and what we can do to accelerate these sanitation programs in our own countries. Now, in closing, allow me to express my gratitude to our major partners who have generously supported this event. And they are, so special thank you to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Urban Climate Resilience Trust Fund, which is financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, the governments of Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the Federal Ministry of Republic of Austria. Your unwavering support to ADB's work in sanitation strengthens our mandate to work towards a water secure and resilient Asia and the Pacific, which is highlighted in our own Strategy 2030. And of course, our government targets, partners' targets. Lastly, I would like to welcome my water sector colleagues from the ADB. I encourage all of us, all of you to share your stories, your experiences and lessons in promoting inclusive sanitation, and your inclusive participation is very critical for this dialogue. So good day again, and welcome again to ADB Sanitation Dialogue 2021. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Neeta. This is a good introduction to the entire event as well as the webinar today. In brief, in this opening webinar, the CWIS concept and the 4 principal elements will be presented and supported by case studies and projects from cities and towns across the Asia and Pacific area that will demonstrate the CWIS benefits and especially compared to the business as usual approach mentioned by Neeta. We also have our experts here who will discuss how CWIS allows institutions to adapt to local conditions. So with this, I'd like to officially start the webinar with our first speaker. We will have, let's go to the session guide, please. We have just a few guidelines that we will be using for this webinar as well as other webinars. To our presenters, you've already been instructed to stay within your time limit, and we encourage you again to do that. I will give you a 2-minute notice just verbally to let you know when your time is coming to an end. To our participants, please participate on the chat, post your comments and questions there. We will be using those for the discussion time that follows. For the discussion period, I will be feeding questions to the presenters. For all of you, please stay on mute during that time unless you are a presenter. And again, please contact tech support for any assistance. So with that, let us go to our first speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Kate Medlicott. Delighted to have you here to kick off this sanitation dialogue for us. Kate is a team lead with sanitation and wastewater at the World Health Organization. Kate, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. So I'm here to present to you the state of the world's sanitation to kick us off in this dialogue. This is a report produced by WHO and UNICEF for the World Toilet Day last year, and it's an urgent call to really, as Neeta said, get beyond business as usual on sanitation and make a big contribution to the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework. It's for all of you to really bring together all the evidence and data on sanitation, and it's also for you to make the case to others, the people you are trying to convince that we need to do more and better on sanitation. So why do we need this report? Well, I think we all know by now, 5 years into the SDG period, we're alarmingly off track. At the current rate of progress, we'll be into the 22nd century before we meet our goals on sanitation. Clearly, that's too slow. And sanitation is a human right. This is not a question of we should invest in sanitation or something else. It's a human right, and everybody has the right to live with safety and dignity, and also to not be impacted by the world. So where are we? These are the global numbers. There's 2 things to notice here since 2000 and 2017. One is there's a lot more people in the world, and we have made progress. But you can see that we still have over 2 billion people that lack even a basic toilet, 4.2 billion people who lack safely managed sanitation. That's the kind of sanitation that's really going to make a difference for health. And of course, nearly 700 million who still practice open defecation. And the numbers in schools and healthcare facilities are also staggering. So what are the consequences of poor sanitation? I think we all know these well, but they really bear repeating. They are stark. They're illness and disease. There's particularly diseases like cholera, poor nutrition, stunting, that all still raging without and really can't be controlled until we get a handle on better sanitation. And these are diseases that affect the most vulnerable and exacerbate inequalities. Not only that, it leads to enormous costs on the healthcare system, lost income for families, foregone educational opportunities. So the question to us is, really, why are we leaving all of these benefits for health, society, and the economy on the table? We need to address sanitation to claim all of those benefits. It's just a reminder, when we talk about sanitation, we're talking about all steps of the sanitation chain. So not just a toilet, but making sure that waste is safely managed through emptying, transport, conveyance, whether that's on an on-site system or within a sewer, to safe disposal or end use. And because of that, you can see in that chain, actually, we've previously tended to think about a toilet as a private good, but in fact, most of that chain is outside of the control of any individual household. We must start considering sanitation as a public good, and it needs to be defined as an essential public service, and governments must ensure that everybody has access to all of the steps of the sanitation chain. So where are we at in terms of the investment? I mean, we know that it's going to be expensive, but also know that the costs of inaction are much greater. There's huge recurrent costs of preventable healthcare costs to the health system. And we know that these investments in sanitation are going to generate positive externalities across society. The economic benefits of sanitation have been estimated to be 5 times the cost. So really, while it's expensive, the cost of inaction would be much higher. And the estimated cost globally of reaching our goals is $105 billion. So unfortunately, the funding that we need has not materialized. And that's the consequence of political commitment and perhaps an unwillingness to talk about sanitation. This is the data from the GLASS report that shows that of the 80% of respondent countries reported insufficient funding to meet their national sanitation targets. So you see those gaps are very large in urban, but also large funding gaps in rural sanitation as well. So perhaps at this point you're feeling a little depressed, thinking that the task ahead of us is enormous. But in fact, we can imagine a better future. And I'm going to show you how, through an ambitious and well-coordinated scale up, this is actually within reach. Here I'm just summarizing the main recommendations of the WHO guidelines on sanitation and health. This is an extremely comprehensive look at all of the evidence about what works and making sure we get the best health bang for our buck out of the sanitation investments. And this is the kind of top lines of where we need to go. Maybe no surprises here. We need to make sure that everyone everywhere has a decent toilet. That's a matter of safety and dignity. But if we want the health gains, we really have to have safely managed sanitation systems. So we're not just talking about facilities, we're talking about services. And when we're talking about services, we need to understand that there are people needed to manage those services. So of course we need a larger and better sanitation workforce, and one that works with safety and dignity. The fourth point here is around sanitation as a sector in its own right. We need to make sure that sanitation has a higher profile, but at the same time, we need to make sure it's well coordinated with other local services. And finally, we need to make sure that the health sector is really playing its role. There's some really specific, obviously not running the whole sanitation systems, others can do that, but there's very important functions the health sector needs to play. So let's just look at some of the progress here. These are the historical rates of change you can see from 2000 to 2017. So in order to reach safely managed sanitation, we need to double quadruple our progress on safely managed sanitation and double our progress on basic sanitation. Maybe this doesn't look so stark here, but it's a very significant rate of change in rate of progress to meet the targets that countries have set themselves. And of course, when we look at countries with the most inequalities, in fact, it's sevenfold. Okay, so but while the challenge is significant, history shows us that it can be done, and in a generation. Many countries have made massive progress, and we can look to examples in the Asia region, including Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, and Malaysia, that actually transformed their societies within a generation. And some might say, oh, that you need the economic growth, but in fact, at the time that those transformations were made, the per capita level of income in those countries was less than many sub-Saharan African countries today. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take you through the acceleration framework. So the SDG 6 acceleration framework looks at action in these 5 areas: governance, financing, capacity development, data and information, and innovation. So first, clearly, as good governance, we need really strong governance, effective coordination and regulation to deliver on sanitation, where it's defined as an essential service, it's recognised as a multi-sectoral issue, and it's included in national strategies and policies and plans at the highest level. And critically, it has to make sure that a mix of approaches are there. So not just sewers, but a mix of approaches that works for everybody. The second is financing. We need to really look at how we change the financing. As a public good, we need to make sure that public financing goes into reaching the poorest and galvanizing contributions from households and the private sector, and making use of all of those different financing options: taxes, tariffs, transfers, repayable finance, and so forth. The third is capacity development. We really have to invest in capacity, not just training, but building a bigger and more skilled workforce. Historically, because sanitation has not been kind of so sexy, there's been a terrible underinvestment in capacity of the workforce. So we need more diverse, gender balanced and skilled workforce with more dignified jobs. The next is data. We need really good data to drive progress. And then finally, innovation. We must look at more innovative approaches. So the final thing, and this is a little hard to see, but this is really the question to us: what kind of future do we want? Do we want this business as usual with all of these benefits left unclaimed, or do we want an acceleration in which we can not only improve sanitation, but improve all of these other things? Thank you. I'm sorry I've gone a little over time, but I hope I can pick up on some of this in the break. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for setting the scene for us, especially. That's very helpful. I'd like to now introduce 2 speakers who are sharing the stage with each other: Lachlan Guthrie, Research Fellow and Project Manager in Integrated Water Management and WASH at the International Water Center at Griffith University, and Stephen Kenway, Professor and Research Group Leader in the Water Energy Carbon Nexus Advanced Water Management Center at the University of Queensland. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thanks for that, Andrea. So I'll be speaking first. My name's Lachlan Guthrie. I'm from the International Water Center at Griffith University. And I'll be talking about some work that Steve and I worked on together, the Asian Water Development Outlook. So the Asian Water Development Outlook, or ADO as we call it, is the ADB's flagship water security report. And so there's been several iterations, the most recent being released late last year in 2020. And throughout ADO, they look at water security across 5 key dimensions in 49 countries in the Asia Pacific region. And so as that diagram shows there, both key dimension 1 and key dimension 3, rural household water security and urban water security, they both explicitly include sanitation, as they should. I'll be talking about key dimension 1, and then Steve will follow me with key dimension 3. So for KD1, rural household water security, there was 4 indicators that we used. So water supply, sanitation, then health impacts from WASH, and also the affordability of WASH services. So not only is one of those indicators there sanitation, but sanitation is also embedded into the health impacts and also affordability. So both of those those two indicators look at not just water services, water supply, but all water services, including sanitation and hygiene. So to measure the sanitation, we use the Joint Monitoring Program service levels to find a raw score, which was then banded to give a score from 1 to 5. As you would probably expect, more points were given to countries with higher proportions of population living with better service levels. So there was two key limitations in this study, and the first being that safely managed sanitation, as Kate was just talking about, wasn't able to be considered in this study because it was only available for 7 of the 49 countries. So one of the issues that Kate mentioned before about data access and the availability of data, absolutely, that's a really critical issue in studies like this, and to know the situation in safely managed sanitation. And then the final one there, the final limitation, was that the data we used was from 2017 estimates using the most recently available joint monitoring program. So there's a little bit of a lag. So while we're talking about 2020 as a water security index, the data has actually come from 2017. So just jumping through the results quite quickly, as you'd expect, it was the wealthier countries, the advanced economies and wealthier parts of Central West Asia that scored the best. The poorest scorers there, Solomons, PNG, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, Mongolia, India, Kiribati, Vanuatu, and the Marshall Islands. I'm sure no one's too shocked that those countries scored the lowest in their access to sanitation. And so one aspect of ADO is its multi-year iterations. And so we're able to see that most of the improvements were actually in South Asia and Southeast Asia, particularly in India, Cambodia, Laos, and Nepal. So India was a really interesting case because despite the data not being able to include the recent Swachh Bharat mission improvements that you've seen in India, it still was the fastest improving country in the period from 2014 to 2017. It was really quite interesting, and people from India should be strongly congratulated by that. And I'd also like to just reiterate that they would probably have had a much higher score had we been looking at 2020 data. And then finally there, the majority of the countries that were moving backwards were actually located in the Pacific, and that's something that's very worrying. So just quickly into the findings and sort of, why is this important? So firstly, we were able to see a clear correlation between better services and affordability, and then also with health impacts. So as Kate was saying before, if you do provide more affordable and better services, you do see those improvements to your health outcome. As I mentioned before, gaps in safely managed data really need to be urgently filled. It's very hard to improve something if you're not measuring it. And so that's something that should be addressed with urgent attention. Further, so we noticed that rural sanitation lags behind rural water supply and also water and sanitation in the urban setting. And so this is likely because rural households are less able to afford things than compared to their urban neighbours. And also, as Kate mentioned, that sanitation is not seen as a separate industry from water, and doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So I think that means that rural sanitation really most closely embodies the SDG principle of leaving no one. Makes it clear our need to better engage with rural vulnerable communities, understanding that a one-size-fits-all model will not work, and different technologies and different service delivery models may be required in different countries and dealing with different vulnerable groups. It was also noted that that human resource capacity was a potentially huge risk to other countries further stagnating, and this is something that Kate also talked about. We identified that as potentially the greatest risk to rural household water security in the next 5 to 10 years. And then further, as I mentioned before, the stagnation in the Pacific Islands is quite concerning and in need of urgent and special attention. Now I'll just hand over to Steve and he'll go through key dimension 3.
Thank you very much. Similar to Lachlan, I'll talk about the Asian Water Development Outlook, which is available from the link in this report, and it's the cover. I'd like to cover a snapshot of urban water security. So we're looking at the cities with current statistics on sanitation across Asia and the Pacific. So urban water security, what is it? We define urban water security as meaning sustainably meeting the community's water needs now and in future, and also meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Our definition was that urban water security assesses the extent to which countries are providing safely managed, which obviously connects to the Sustainable Development Goals, and affordable water and sanitation services to their urban communities to meet those desired outcomes. And obviously, Sustainable Development Goal 6.2 seeks to achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and end open defecation. There's related SDGs of 6.1, 11.5, and 11.6. So similar to KD1, which Lachlan just presented, key dimension 3, or urban water security, attributed 5 points to an access to water supply, 5 points to sanitation, which we'll particularly talk about here, 5 points to affordable water and sanitation, and then a further 2 points for drainage and environment. So looking across urban water security, you can see the graph on the right-hand side covers all the key elements of urban water security, and I've highlighted in orange and red the sanitation, which is the second color, or the red color on the bar. But there are 7 countries at nascent or level 1 that include the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, so very similar to KD1. And that was collectively nearly 2 million people on those Pacific islands, largely.
2 minutes.
There's also a second level, which was engaged, which is also at insufficient security level, which is nearly 800 million people. So it's really, how do we move category 2 to category 3, which is a critical question. You can also see that while there are 17 countries ranked 1 and 15 ranked 2, there's a massive gap to the countries ranked 5. For example, that included Australia, China, Hong Kong, Japan, New Zealand, and Singapore. There's quite a big step gap between the countries that are ranked 1 and 2 and the countries that are ranked 5. Similar to KD1, we had banding scores, but to hit KD3, level 3, or the level 3 indicator, the table on the bottom left, it needs to have a moderate proportion of the urban population receiving affordable, safely managed water and supply services. And a big gap in the data, the countries wanting to know, how do we get to level 3? Well, pretty much you need at least 15% reported in safely managed. And similar to the message that came from Lachlan, there was quite a few countries, particularly in the bands 1 and 2, that were not reporting safely managed data, so safely managed sanitation levels. We also applied a rating of data quality, and we wanted to acknowledge those countries that are tracking and monitoring safely managed performance of sanitation. So to conclude, similar to KD1, investment in suitable solutions is needed to provide cost-effective access to improve wastewater collection, treatment, and recycling, and consequently inclusive sanitation. That's needed broadly throughout regions of Southeast Asia, Central and West Asia, and South Asia and the Pacific. It's not just infrastructure, but also strengthened monitoring, data availability, governance, and management. We see also many opportunities to solve some water and sanitation problems simultaneously because they're often interconnected. For example, investment in wastewater recycling to offset demand for potable water, particularly for outdoor, for irrigation uses, etc., and in some industrial purposes. There are many improvements possible, including improving our definition and analysis of sanitation, index and urban water security. That involves strengthening the connection to risk, increasing the future outlook, and subnational assessment. So we've been able to perform the analysis across 49 countries at country scale. We'd very much like to move to city scale, but as Lachlan mentioned, we're often constrained by limited data. We also believe further development of the sanitation index is warranted and starting to track that through time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both Lachlan and Stephen, and to Kate for your presentations. We now have time, about 5 minutes time for questions. I'd like to field one question to each set of speakers. So to you, Kate, first. The first question is regarding your provocative statement about the cost of inaction. So I'll just read the question. How do you monetize the cost from inaction for sanitation measures, as this is an important factor to convince more actions, especially from LGs. Actually, I don't know what LGs is. Could you share that, what that is, if perhaps other people don't know?
Yeah, so in terms of the cost of inaction, I mean, there are many, and they're not especially well quantified because they sit across so many different areas. But for example, you've got diseases like cholera, many neglected tropical diseases, where you just all of the investment is going into firefighting mode every year, just putting out fires instead of actually getting to the root cause of the problem. And some of these diseases, like some of the neglected tropical diseases, like worms and so forth, they're getting to quite low levels. So people think, oh, the problem is gone, but if we don't invest in sanitation, it's going to come back, and then those costs are going to come back again. We've also got things around the health system. 15% of people who go into a hospital come out with an infection they didn't come in with because of poor water and sanitation. So again, the costs of that are big but not well estimated. Antimicrobial resistance is threatening to kind of to take down modern healthcare as we know it. But roughly speaking, as I said, it's a 5-to-1 ratio in terms of cost effectiveness.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'd like to now field a question over to Lachlan and Steve. With the Pacific being highlighted as a stagnating area in terms of sanitation, due to geographically dispersed islands, centralized sanitation systems are not feasible. So the question is, what innovations are there in 2021 for rural sanitation, including new approaches in behavioral change?
So Steve, if that's okay, I'll have a first crack at this. So one thing, and one of the, I noticed one of the commenters in chat just pointed this out. Behavior change was a really key element of the Swat Bharat mission in India, which has been shown to have really excellent success. So I think that because we're looking in the Pacific, and you've got very small catchments, very localized and very contextual solutions are needed. And so potentially it's that behavior change, it's sanitation marketing, and it's the soft skills that are really what we need to improve. And so not particularly pushing one technology over another, and I'm not aware of any new technologies, but really looking at those soft skills, building the capacity of local practitioners, and building the desire and the understanding of why sanitation is important in those communities. I think that might be a good way forward in this post-COVID era.
Thank you so much, Lachlan. I appreciate that. I would like to move on now to our other speakers. We do have a longer discussion period coming up, and so some of the questions that have been posted, we can get to those later during the longer discussion period. So thank you all three of our first speakers, and we'll now turn to our next speaker. I'd like to now introduce Roshan, Deputy Director of Urban Sanitation Markets at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Roshan, we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Andrea. So hello, everybody from different parts of the world. It's very nice to see you virtually. And many thanks to Asian Development Bank to organizing such an important event. And today, this 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about the citywide inclusive sanitation, because the understanding of the citywide inclusive sanitation is not really very much clear, because colleagues are many people, they talk about citywide means access to sanitation to entire city. But inclusive component is very much critical here. This is different than any other system what we are talking about in the past. This is one good example why we need to talk about inclusive sanitation. So you can see two figures here of sheet flow diagram. One figure, and in left hand side you can see citywide scale, where you can see the sanitation coverage of safely managed sanitation is 54%. When you see the same city, when you just track the low-income area, then you can see that only 25% of safely managed sanitation service are available. So this is a general in many cities in Asia or around the world, that the poor community don't have safely managed sanitation services. At the same time, you see the sanitation type as well. In the citywide scale, when you see there, then you can see sewer system and on-site sanitation system. But in case of the non-sewer area. In case of low-income area, you can see only one type of system, that is non-sewer area. So that means there is a big inequity issues are there to address the sanitation. That's why we come around about the idea about citywide inclusive sanitation need to be addressed. And here, like this is very interesting thing. That's what going on in the past, like the trend of the changing of the sanitation implementation approach. For example, maybe 10 years back, we never talk about non-sewer sanitation. We all talk about the sanitation master planning, means everybody is thinking about the large sewer system and then the treatment system and so on. But and at the same time, all investment, whatever is coming to the sanitation system or sewer system is coming from the loan, and then it's quite expensive and limited coverage, and also the highly income people are getting benefit. All those things were happening in the past. And then in last 7-8 years, we all are advocating for non-sewer sanitation and fecal management. Then when we look at this non-sewer sanitation and fecal management, the problem now, what happened is it is very much small scale going on, and there's a lot of pilots, and mostly running by the NGOs, and it is small scale, it's never scale. And so we thought that maybe it's not also a good approach, because non-sewer sanitation system also needs strong institutional setup. That what Kate also talking about, the public services gap over there as well. Then now we are promoting citywide inclusive sanitation. It addresses the public service approach, and we can ensure with this approach, we can ensure that there is safe and equitable, financial viable sanitation system service can be really established, so that we can ensure that the poor and the marginalized population also will have services for the sanitation system. And when you talk about the principle of sanitation system, there are like the several components are there in the citywide inclusive sanitation. Normally 7 principles we normally advocate for. One is, we all know that everyone needs to get benefit, whether poor, non-poor, everybody should have same services. There should not be any different service system to be established. Similarly, when we talk about the planning, then in the planning stage, we need to have the gender and social equity need to be considered. They need to be empowered. They need to be decision maker. What type of system they need to have, that need to be really planned. Similarly, when we talk about the safely managed, we always talk about the safely managed means we think that if we can have treatment plant or fecal source treatment plant or wastewater treatment plant, this is done. This is not true. You already saw that from WHO colleague that all sanitation value chain, we really need to ensure that each and every component of sanitation services must have we can ensure that there should be insurance that there is safety issue is considered. For example, sanitation workers who are working there, their health also need to be addressed equally besides the other component there. And similarly, we need to have a clear mandate, inclusive mandate that need to be given to the authority so that they will really act. And then we need to have a strong mechanism for the implementation, like what kind of system need to establish. It is hardware, like what kind of hardware, like should we go with the sewer system or the non-sewer system? All need to be defined on the basis of local area need. And any system, whatever you implement, there should be strong business models so that we can ensure that the system will be sustainable in operation and there will not be a problem in future. And at the same time, we need to also consider that when you consider the planning, of course, we need to consider long-term planning, and long-term planning fostering with the innovations. So we never think about how to bring the innovation. Always we do the business as usual. We can bring a lot of technology innovation. We can bring a lot of the system innovation need to be considered so that the poor can have benefit out of that. And at the end, the political will is very, very critical. Without their engagement, we can't really establish accountability mechanism or the authority or mandated authorized authority to be established. All those things cannot be done without political will. And at the same time, we also need a lot of money for that. The resources need to be allocated for that. On the basis of that, we come up with a framework. This is actually a foundation framework we are promoting. Of course, many organizations also agree with that, because we all agree that we need to achieve the outcome. Outcome means we want to set equity, safety, and sustainability. These are the 3 outcomes we want to achieve, and this is also part of the sustainable development goal as well. And to achieve these outcomes, without having institutional system in place, we can't really see that outcome. We can't really achieve this outcome. Maybe these outcomes can only be seen in the small project or some small city, but you never be able to achieve the system as a whole. at a national level or regional or global level. That's why we need to have a strong CWIS functions. Function means we need to have mandated authority who really will be responsible to execute the program in the city or country. And we must need to have accountability mechanism. That means city also need to be monitored by the certain KPIs. Even the private sector is providing services on the support of city, there should be accountability mechanism who really monitor them. So that accountability mechanism to be established in the country, and also it can also be the city level as well. At the same time, we must need to have a proper resource planning and management means like how the money coming from the central government to the local government, as well as how the local government really going to apply those resources also need to be considered. This is something the tool that what is now we have developed using in the Bangladesh, for example. Sanitation should not be alone. This should be integrated with the municipal services. And if you integrate with the municipal services, then the system will be sustainably implemented. And this IMIS system is already tried in a couple of the cities in South Asia. And then once you have a strong IMIS system in the city, then you can easily plan and manage, and monitoring and evaluation system can be established. Once you have a strong, powerful tools system established in the city, then once you have IMIS system, then also you can do good sanitation planning. For example, this is the example thanks to Asian Development Bank, ADB already using this tool. And in Madhya Pradesh, they have one city, they have very nicely done this planning where the city are divided into several zones, and on the basis of that, poor, non-poor areas identified, sewer, non-sewer zone is identified. All with the topography, with the geographical situation and density, population density, everything considered. And this is very important component. This is about the mapping the poor, how you really reach the poor, and also it can also draw with the IMIS system so that you will identify who are the poor, where the poor are, what kind of containment system they are using, how their system are there, how the drain system is going on. That really give you the real way to reach to the poor. And without that, you cannot really reach the poor. And finally, this is my last slide. You can see that all colleagues talk about human capacity. Capacity building is a more major component we need to consider. And then the country and city need to really engage, and their political will, rules and policy, regulations need to be established. And because of that, then a lot of financing institutions like the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, when they put the money, then they really need to consider the CWIS approach to be implemented, so that we can have sustainable sanitation services can be established at the large scale. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roshan, for that overview of CWIS and the detailed information. At this time, we'd like to move to our next speaker. Norio Saito is the Director of Urban Development and Water Division in the South Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank. Welcome, Norio. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. So thank you for having me here today. And it is my pleasure to talk about ADB's engagement in sanitation. So I'll give you a broad picture of how ADB is strengthening its support to sanitation. And I will talk about a few project examples from South Asia where I'm working for. So the first slide shows ADB investment in sanitation in the last 10 years. From 2011 to 2020, ADB's financing to sanitation amounted to $4.9 billion to benefit 50 million people. So sanitation investments equal 21% of the total water sector portfolio. The map shows regional distribution. So South Asia is the largest in terms of investment volume of $1.9 billion. And East Asia has the largest number of beneficiaries with 26.1 million. So this slide shows the sanitation investments over time. So there's no clear trend, but we may be able to say that the proportion of non-sewer sanitation investments, which you can see on the right-hand side, is gradually increasing, although slowly, except for a few outliers like 2011 and 2018. But still, non-sewer sanitation is rather limited in terms of investment volume. So those small in investment volumes, the number of beneficiaries from non-sewer sanitation investment is not very small at 11.7 million population. So this is coming from investments that are both sewered and non-sewered sanitation systems. So cumulative investments in non-sewer sanitation systems on the right-hand side reached 285 million by 2020, starting from 2011. So if the commitment given in 2020, which is about $80 million, will continue for the next 2 years, then achieving the target of 400 million by 2020 will be possible. So this is an important slide, so I would like to spend a little bit time on this. So to promote sanitation in general and non-network sanitation in particular, ADB has been adopting multi-pronged approach. So these are investments, piloting new strategies, operators capacity building, strengthening policies and standards, and awareness raising. So for investments, we often start small. Like in Rajasthan in India, this case, 2 million grant was first provided to pilot 3 fecal sludge treatment plants. And after successful demonstration, support was scaled up using loan resources. New technologies are piloted, often using grant resources, as you see examples from Mongolia and Cambodia. ADB has resources to support water operators partnerships or WOPs, and some WOPs target non-network sanitation, as mentioned here for Nepal, Bangladesh, and Mongolia. Supporting policies and strategies are very important to establish better enabling environment. Examples include institutional regulatory framework for FSM in Nepal, and also state FSM policy and implementation guidelines in Rajasthan. Initiatives are also ongoing in China, Mongolia, the Philippines, and Papua New Guinea. So knowledge sharing and trainings are also being organized to enhance awareness of various stakeholders. We can integrate these arrangements based on the need of each project and each country. And these have been effective in increasing non-network sanitation investments over time. Next slide is about CWIS. So this was already explained well by Roshan Ji from BMGF, so I will not discuss in detail. So what is useful is that it provides elements that we should look at in order to achieve CWIS. So these are institutions, safety and reliability, equity and inclusion, and sustainability. So this will help us analyze holistically and offer integrated solutions based on the data and evidence collected at the field. So this slide shows examples of South Asia projects that incorporate the CWIS from Bangladesh, Nepal, and India. Third Urban Governance and Infrastructure Improvement Project, approved in 2014 in Bangladesh, is probably one of the first projects where sanitation action plans have been prepared in each of the 30 project towns. We got support from BMGF for this. So based on the analysis of current status, the action plans recommended incremental, practical, and step-by-step solutions. And we have seen good progress in improving sanitation in these towns. Although this is still work in progress, and the recent analysis done by BMGF identified gaps and areas for further improvement, we can say we are moving to the right direction. We have new projects planned in these 3 countries, as you can see in this slide, which are now in various stages of preparation. In the next slides, I will just talk about the 2 projects that were approved last year. The first is about Kurna sewage project in Bangladesh. So this is a bit busy slide, but the point I want to highlight here is that the project addresses all 5 elements that I just explained: investment, new technologies, capacity building, strengthening standards, and awareness raising. So this project mainly supports the establishment of a centralized sewage stream management system, but includes construction of 1 FSTP. In Kurna, collection and transportation of fecal sludge is the responsibility of the local government, Kurna City Corporation, or KCC, not the water utility. So ADB facilitated MOU signing between KCC and Kurna Wasa to foster collaboration, so that the fecal sludge collected and transported by KCC would be safely treated in FSTP managed by Kurna Wasa. Moreover, now we are discussing to mobilize some TA resources to support development of FSM strategy action plan in collaboration with SNB of the Netherlands and the BMGF. My last slide is about our urban project in Madhya Pradesh in India. Roshanji also touched upon this project a little bit. So in this municipality, which is one of the project towns, currently there is no sewage management system in place. So the original proposal from the state government was to develop a centralized system to cover 64% of the population. So in collaboration with BMGF team, we made further assessment to incorporate non-sewage sanitation solutions for the excluded areas to cover 100% of the population. So in some areas, DWATS is proposed, and in other areas, FSM plus grey water management is proposed. State government really appreciated and accepted these recommendations, and now the project is moving in this direction. So in summary, using the 5 elements in an integrated manner, such as awareness raising of decision makers, evidence-based analytical work, and pilot testing, ADB has been able to strengthen its support to CWIS and will continue this endeavor to help achieve the SDG goals 6.2. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norio. So thanks to all 5 of our speakers, we are now starting a longer discussion period of just about a half an hour, not quite. We have a number of questions that have been feeding in from the chat, so thank you very much for that. I'm going to start with a question for Norio, since Norio, you just finished speaking. So someone has noted that O&M is a big issue for developing countries. How can we strengthen O&M of service delivery by city authorities?
Thank you, Andrea, for that question. And that's an excellent question. And this O&M sustainability is really one key issue that we have been working hard, but we have also been struggling a little bit. So, particularly for the O&M issue, if we just rely on the tariff, or if it's like a dislodging, charges, it will be very difficult to fully recover the cost. So normally the ADB's approach is consider 3 T's: tariff, tax, and transfer. So we may be able to use water supply tariff to partially subsidize the wastewater and sewage management. And also maybe we can support local governments to increase local taxes, like a property taxes, like a conservancy tax, which can supplement the charges collected by the local governments. So this kind of integrated approach is important, and I think we are going to that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Norio. I'm going to stay with you for a second and name a question that will go also to Roshan. In the same vein around city authorities, do you have any good working examples of integrated municipal information systems that have been instrumental in planning CWIS? Are there any tools or publications related to this? So maybe start with Norio and then go to Roshan with that same question.
Sure. Integrated MIS is very important, and we have been sort of piloting in a few cities or few states, and Madhya Pradesh is one of them. And I see great potential to utilize this kind of system, because that way the local government can capture holistically not only the services on sanitation, but also their support to water supply, this property tax, other aspects of the municipal management. And in order to provide services in a sustainable way, as I just mentioned, we need to address those issues in a systematic way. So in that way, I think we can further work on supporting this IMIS in local governments.
Thank you, Norio. Over to you, Roshan. Do you have any thoughts on IMIS systems and how they can be instrumental in planning for CWIS?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I believe this is one of the powerful tools so far. We are working since last more than 4 years. And it is really after a lot of experiment, a lot of work done by the team of IMIS who designed it, the professionals from the Nepal who did that. And then after that, that is implemented in the Bangladesh in a couple of cities together with SNB. And then we are quite confident by using this tool in Bangladesh, a couple of cities after that, and the way how we use that in case of Khulna itself in Bangladesh, the way how we plan that the sewer, non-sewer, all those things we did there. At the same time, how this is really linked to entire municipal system that integrated there in those two cities in Khulna and Jenaida in Bangladesh. It gave us very good confidence that this really works very well, not only for the planning, it helps to do the system design, and at the same time project implementation on the basis of the need, and as well as the monitoring and the operation maintenance of the system of entire infrastructure. That is also one of the big issue because it generates a lot of data. So without data, you really can't really really can't maintain the system, and it will really bring the time series data, and that really helps in the future as well. That's why, and as per our experience from the Bangladesh, then it expanded to now in India together with Asian Development Bank, and then also in Nepal, also a couple of cities they are trying. So we really we are excited with this tool, and we will be expanding, we'll be supporting our best to scale this IMIS in many projects, many countries beyond South Asia, beyond Asia. It may also go to the Africa as well. It needs, of course, a lot of capacity building need to be launched. That will help to understand more on that, and we'll be expanding this work in future. Over.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you. I'd like to stay on this topic of governments and CWIS. So I have a question that I think most of you may want to weigh in on our two speakers here. Substantial investments are required by government and cannot rely too heavily on the private sector. How do we get governments to invest at the required levels when for the last 20 plus years, they have not been investing at the required levels? So here, I'd love to turn to Kate, if you would like to weigh in on this question. I would also like to turn to Norio and Roshan.
Yeah,
Kate, would you like to weigh in?
I'm happy to make a start, and I'm not certain I have all the answers, but I can give you some thoughts. So I think first is we have to elevate the discussion. There's really no point us fighting between water and sanitation or hygiene for a small pie, right? We have to lift this up to the highest level of government and ask for the funding at that level. I think another one is that we need to avoid some common traps, and ones that we see in the health sector is things like, oh, but shouldn't we just invest in financing? Sanitation's too expensive. It means should we invest in vaccines? Sorry, can't we get the health result with that instead of sanitation? We can't fall into traps like that, right? Sanitation is a human right. It needs to be done, and it's complementary, not an alternative to some of these other interventions. Another trap is around the private sector. It's like, oh, isn't this a private responsibility? Households should take care of it. We can't fall into that trap. And I think there's another trap around reuse. I think some people, oh yeah, we can reuse and resource recovery. Yes, that's an important part of the mix, but we cannot look to that to finance sanitation. It's a contribution, not a result. Just one other thing I think is that one of the really critical things is around governance and regulation. We have to sort out gaps and overlaps and mandates within countries about who's doing what, who needs to be getting the money and who needs to deliver on it. That's absolutely critical before you can even be asking for the funding, and it's not clear in many cases. And then linked to that, as I said, is the data. Those responsible agencies need to make sure they're armed with really high quality data to make that case. So those are some of the things we can do and not do, I think, to strengthen this case for financing.
Thank you so much, Kate. Norio and Roshan, would you like to weigh in on this question about how do we get governments to invest at the required levels?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, of course, it's a challenging question and it cannot be solved overnight. But maybe I can say 3 points. One is that we need to raise we need to convince the central government to allocate more resources for sanitation. So that one, like a study by UNICEF, WHO, that is very useful. How much it would cost if we don't address sanitation issues. So that is more costly than not investing in sanitation. So that kind of awareness raising or convincing is necessary. The second part is that we can, try to support or promote more efficient sanitation systems. And CWIS is one good tool to make that kind of assessment. Because conventionally, when we talk about sanitation, people often thought about centralized wastewater management system, which is much more costly than DWATS or this FSM plus gray water management. So that way, we can achieve almost a similar objectives, similar targets with much less cost in a more efficient way. So that's the second point. The third point is, as I mentioned, we cannot just expect the tariffs to cover the entire sanitation cost, operation and CapEx. We need to mobilize other resources. It could be, domestic resources like local taxes and the transfers from the central government to local government. Private sector or NGOs may be able to support a certain part. So we have to address in a holistic manner for this a very important agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norio. Roshan, would you like to weigh in on this question too?
Yeah, sure. Sure, Andrea. Here, actually, the first thing is the policy and institutional reforms. That should be the first priority, because when we talk about the public service approach, doesn't mean that all money need to come from government. The government role should be how to create enabling environment so that all can join in hand there. So institutional reforms is very much critical. I really like the way how Bangladesh is moving forward, the way how it takes time. Definitely, we can't really see that immediately it will happen. But you need to have a very good base for that. Means the way how Bangladesh is now moving forward is the first step was building approving for the institutional and regulatory framework for the sanitation, urban sanitation, for the fecal management and CWIS. That really stepping stone for them. And it really helped to build the structure in the country that who is responsible, who is a mandate, who is accountable, everything will be set up. And once that is happened, then there will be a chance to have a local resource mobilization. And then at that time, what Norio-san is saying that we need to bring up with the very easy method. Like the sanitation is not the infrastructure anymore. Sanitation is system, sanitation is the services. So how you really improve service means if you cut down infrastructure, cost automatically will go down. Right now, the way how we are estimating sanitation cost is based on the infrastructure. That's a totally wrong approach. Even the way how the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, whatever bank, International Bank is estimating sanitation investment is wrong. So it needs to be changed, the estimation as well. So if you consider it that way, then the cost will be reduced. Then the government will be attractive. Okay, now it's easy to go. And then government will then invite the more and more, the partnership with the private sector with the community and the citizen, and then it will go very well. And main thing is government need to come up with a very good sustainable operation maintenance plan, accountability mechanism, so that they can really monitor the system, how it's going. I think it will go. I think this is the way to go, and then maybe this is the way how we can achieve the sustainable development goal as well. Otherwise, if you only think about money, it's not going to happen. Over.
Thank you, Roshan. I'd like to bring Stephen and Lachlan into the conversation. Could we bring them into the spotlighted group? And Stephen, I see you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was a great question about how to keep government accountable. And I think the Asian Development Bank's Asian Water Development Outlook, which tracks the performance and sanitation and other security indexes through time and across countries, is part of that intent to help keep the focus on the appropriate levels. And we've seen quite a few countries, Thailand, Indonesia, India, etc., starting to do subnational assessments. So using some of the similar methods to participate or to partition at either province level or state level, similar indicators, and then also countries overlaying their national investment in sewerage infrastructure or sanitation against those indices, so that you can see is investment actually being targeted at the areas that current sanitation levels are lowest? So I guess often when there's an indicator or an index or a number or a score, people become very interested in that. And I guess that becomes a mechanism. But I guess my main point is for those countries where sanitation is low, then or where it's still a large issue to be managed, perhaps a subnational index or a greater attention to more regular updating of a sanitation index to really keep the data current and overlaying that with the investment.
Thank you, Stephen. There was a question for you and Lachlan along those same lines. I'll just read it to you. Can we develop a community-based indicator for evaluating sustainability of any local sanitation system and its associated infrastructure? Also, could this be used to evaluate the sustainability of a single sanitation system, as well as to compare two or more systems? Steve, you're muted.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. I think the challenge with anything which is as multidimensional as that is if we're trying to cover all of Asia, say 3 billion people in a consistent way, where the data would come from. But if it is a ground up driven system, driven on people's perceptions, etc., or if it is at a national scale in a particular country, where you can get large data sets that are internally consistent, but not necessarily comparable from country to country, then I think the answer would be definitely yes.
Thank you. Lachlan, you looked like you were ready to share. Please go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I completely agree with everything Steve just said. I'd also like to add that, so with the formulation of the joint monitoring program, there's some serious inconsistencies in the national reports that feed into that. And that's been one of the issues that's not enabled us to be able to have good, safely managed data. So I think that the further you break that down and the more community-based and bottom-up that would be, the greater potential you would have for inconsistencies and as Steve says, data that's not necessarily comparable across countries. So I think that would be the main concern I would have there is ensuring that the people who are inputting the data, they really understand what makes a sustainable sanitation system and understand how, when they're putting that data in and ensuring that the data is accurate and therefore can be comparable across countries.
Thank you, Lachlan. The next question, let's start with Lachlan and Steve, but it's really a question potentially for all of you. How can we make marginalized urban communities lay claim to basic sanitation services and make them participate in the sustainability of community sanitation systems? So let's give Steve and Lachlan a chance to answer that, and then we'll turn to anyone else who'd like to share their thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very important question as well. One of the really intriguing things that we found in doing the Asian Water Development Outlook is the way informal settlements are handled. And I'm not sure how many people realize that the definition of what is urban and what is rural and is very country dependent and makes comparison of statistics from country to country very tricky. And so we adopted a philosophy very strongly with the Asian Development Bank and AIDO that informal settlements were part of urban centres, and then we could consistently go through and track which informal settlements were part of which cities or which were part of cities according to that country's definition. So I think just identifying where informal settlements and the related impact on communities is occurring. Is it occurring in the rural settlements? Is it occurring in urban? Which statistic which is being reported are those groups consistently part of, so that they can be tracked more readily? I think is a really important starting point. But it proves it's proven to be very difficult to have a consistent definition for what is a city and what is not a city.
Thank you, Steve. Lachlan, did you want to add any thoughts or go over to the other speakers?
Maybe just quickly. So my work was in rural areas, but I think when we're talking about vulnerable groups, there's a lot of crossover. So I think that to be successful with vulnerable communities, and this was shown on one of the slides Roshan was showing, you need to engage early and you need to engage genuinely. So engagement with vulnerable communities, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term a box ticking exercise. So really where if you're just doing it so that you can say that you've done it, it doesn't help anybody. You need to, when you go into these communities, you need to be very motivated for your plan and your project or your program to be informed by the engagement, not having a plan in mind, going in and telling people this is what the plan will be. So it really needs to be early and genuine, the engagement with vulnerable communities.
Thank you, Lachlan. So I want to give Norio and Kate and Roshan an opportunity, if they wish, to also respond to this question.
Maybe I could
Roshan?
add by, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Roshan.
Roshan and then Kate.
Kate, you want to go first? Go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just going to agree with Lachlan really, and just, I think that it's really on the designers of the programs to really come up with service models that are tailored to the communities that they serve. I think one of the things we've traditionally done, maybe with a kind of an infrastructure mindset, is to provide the service and then hand it over to the community and say, there you go, now you do the operation and maintenance, you run it. And sitting here in semi-rural France, honestly, I can't think of anything worse than having to have a community meeting with my neighbours to talk about managing my septic tank. That's not going to work for me, and I don't think it's going to work for the most vulnerable people in the world. So I think it's really on the people responsible for designing service delivery to really understand the needs and capacities to contribute to pay and all of that for it to work.
Thank you, Kate. Roshan, if you could just briefly add your comment, then I'd like to go on to a different but related question. So go ahead, please.
I would like to go here. Like the first thing is, again, that it comes like a data, because how do you know that where the poor is? So, and once you understand the poor here, where like it's not only the informal settlement and the slum area, because poor households are everywhere. It's spread all over the city. Then how you really identify them? That's why, again, I'm talking to you about IMIS system will help to do that. And it really understand that which households are really poor. And then you need to develop mechanism how to provide the services, like either you go with the financing mechanism to solve them, or you can have an incentive. All those things mechanisms are there. But the problem is we never identify where poor is located. So that's why any investment, when you plan, the planning should be done in such a way that we invest a little bit more money to identify them as a poor. That's why in our CWIS principle number 2, we have mentioned that equity and social equity and the gender. So those components need to be really structured properly so that you really support them in designing field. I agree with also a colleague from Lachlan, right? What you're saying. You said quite right. Over.
Thank you, Roshan. So we have a related question around behavior change, and I'm going to start with Kate, but the question is available to everyone. So several people have mentioned the importance of behavioral change in relation to sanitation. And the question for Kate is, have you established or quantified its linkage to improving sanitation?
So there's been a lot of a huge amount of work done on behaviour change, particularly through CLTS over the last, it's community-led total sanitation over the last 10, 15 years. And there's a whole chapter in our guidelines on sanitation and health on behaviour change. Some of the key things to take away from it though is that yes, behaviour change is super important. It needs to be done in conjunction with a service delivery. It's not kind of one before or after the other, but concurrently. And secondly, that while tools like CLTS have been really helpful, we actually kind of need to get a little bit deeper into behaviour change science and really understand what are the real drivers of people's behaviour and design our locally specific drivers of behaviour, which can be very cultural and very locally specific. and then design our programs specifically around those behavioural determinants, which we know and generally is not things like concerns for health. It might be around status, it might be around family relationships, all sorts of things. But to understand those drivers of behaviour change and design the program for that in conjunction with a service delivery model.
Thank you, Kate. So this is a fascinating question with many dimensions, and we'd love to hear from at least some of you on this question before we close with probably with one or two more. Anyone? Okay, then I have another question for Norio. Actually, no, I'm going to start with another question for all of you. The question is, incentives or penalties played a role in countries that had much, or did incentives or penalties play a role in countries that had much improved sanitation? And did those things occur at the local, national, or community level? Maybe the question is, to what degree did incentives or penalties play a role? Roshan, you mentioned that briefly. Did you have some specific examples in mind?
Yeah, I think I don't believe on the penalty because it really creates some violence. But I think the incentive and reward and recognition may create much more big changes. This is what actually I have seen in Nepal, for example, the way how Nepal reached to the non-open defecation free ODF status in 4 to 5 years of time, only because of the incentive and reward and recognition. So that really helped community to really act very nicely. So that need to be really considered. And of course, it's also linked to the institutional and regulatory mechanism, more towards the accountability mechanism. So if the government come up with the strong accountability mechanism with the KPI to the city authority, then the city authority also come up with a very good plan to expand services to support their people and their community in their boundaries.
Thank you, Roshan. Norio, you looked like you had something to say on this topic. Would you like to share?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Andrea. No, of course, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by, incentives or penalties. But when it comes to like incentives, of course, incentives in terms of, if it's used for like constructing functional toilets or supporting, good FSM systems. So that kind of incentives to the individuals or the municipalities, that would certainly play a very important role. If it's penalty, of course, we need a good, regulatory systems, and a good enforcement system is important to support sanitation. So in that sense, I see that, the important role of enforcement so that, municipalities or individuals follow the rules. So yeah, that I want to share. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Norio. Oh, yes, Steve, I was just wondering, go ahead, please.
So I think often water supply and consequently sanitation tends to be managed a lot by state government. At least here in Australia, our federal government has responsibility for sort of national issues, but because water is heavy and often driven by local issues, it tends to be more locally managed. And so what we see in many countries in Australia, or many states in Australia, is the state government might put up funding, but often has to be co-matched at a local level. But perhaps there is a need for the federal government to also buy into that when it's a national issue of the scale of sanitation and how it's dragging. But I think the multiple levels of government can confuse that, and to know really clearly what the state's role is versus federal and local.
Thank you, Steve. And I'd like to direct the last question to Norio. Norio-san, what is the one critical step ADB has taken to be able to make significant changes from traditional investing to fecal sludge management and CWIS? How long did this change take place?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, of course, change is gradual and it cannot happen overnight. And first, I think, in the last maybe like 1.5 years, there's a lot of discussion inside ADB about how to promote the CWIS. So in the ADB's case, we have a couple of seminars, workshops, and then the few, pioneers in ADB try to incorporate CWIS in the project design, and they share their practice and lessons with other colleagues through knowledge sharing sessions and internal workshop. And then more and more people got aware of the benefits of CWIS. And now it has been, basically mainstreamed in ADB, and many colleagues are working to incorporate CWIS in the system. So that's how, we have been, strengthening our support to CWIS. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norio. And I'm just watching the time to see we have time for one more question. So I'd like to direct this last question to Lachlan and Steve. It's a question about rural sanitation. Is it likely that rural sanitation will always lag behind, or are there examples of excellent rural sanitation services and how they came about?
So I think that, yes, it is always likely that rural sanitation services will lag behind. It's really an unfortunate element of development that happens in every aspect of development. The wealthier people generally have better services, and that's the case in sanitation. So are there any examples? Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. But again, just wanting to point out the excellent example that we've seen in India over the last couple of years, and potentially that kind of a model, which heavily uses behavior change and also incentives, something we discussed just earlier before. That's something that could potentially work in closing that gap.
Thank you so much.
I also agree. I think just by the very nature, it will fall behind. Rural sanitation will fall behind urban sanitation, partly because the more compact our cities are, the higher density, the bigger the issue, and the easier it is to put in centralized systems. That doesn't mean we can't have equally good and lower cost decentralized systems, but we need centralized management of decentralized systems. A little bit the point Kate was saying, we can't expect communities to do that. I think finding the rationale or the argument for having centralized management of decentralized systems is harder to find than centralized management of sewers and septic tanks or sanitation in cities.
Thank you, Steve. Kate, you have 30 seconds and then we'll close.
Super good. I just wanted to remind people, because it hasn't come up, when we talk about safely managed sanitation, it can be completely safely managed on site. That's one of the definitions. I think sometimes people think it has to be picked up and taken somewhere. That can be expensive, unhealthy, unnecessary in rural areas in some cases. And just quickly, I see in the chat, climate change has come up. We haven't covered it, but yes, super important, and new and interesting work coming up on that. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Kate. Good clarifications and noticing that too. There is a workshop on climate change. I think it's full already, but that topic is indeed being dealt with in this event. So thank you, all of you. Warm, hearty thank you to our first 5 speakers who have kicked off the entire sanitation dialogue event for us. It's a rich conversation, so we thank all of the participants for your comments in the chat. We've got to some of your questions. I know we can't get to all of them, but this is a rich conversation that will be ongoing. I just want to leave you with a few key messages. We recognize the sanitation challenge is indeed significant. We heard that from the statistics presented by Kate. Past approaches do place too much emphasis on infrastructure and neglect other critical elements. We know that CWIS offers a more comprehensive approach to achieving the goal of sanitation service for all, and it has those elements that we talked about during this webinar. It is challenging to apply, but as you can see, people are working with it and experimenting with it. Thanks again to our speakers and to our audience. At this time, I'd just like to issue a few reminders. One is we would like to hear from you about what you thought about today's session and the overall sanitation dialogue. The survey will be available for you to fill out now in the chat, as well as during the rest of the week. If this is the only webinar you plan on attending, please fill out the survey. If you're looking for copies of materials, again, the presentations will be posted a day after this event. Recording of this session will be posted by the end of the week. And if you, for any reason, wish to contact the organizers of this event or the speakers, please follow the contact information at the bottom of this slide. Up next is workshop 1 and the first in our how-to series of sharing climate change strategies for sanitation. And tomorrow at the same time, we have webinar number 2. I look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you very much, everybody. And that concludes webinar number 1. We'll see you tomorrow.